When someone mentions games with their roots in Studio Ghibli, the first thing that likely comes to mind for most people is Ni no Kuni, a well-received RPG series in its own right. But today, we're actually traveling a bit further back than that. No, not Magic Pen Gel, which we will cover in the future, but instead a little bit further to what is commonly referred to as the PlayStation Pokemon, Jade Cocoon. Though, admittedly, that nickname sells the game a bit short, as it did introduce quite a few new innovations over other monster battlers of the time. Now, for me, unlike the previous games we've played on stream for the Nostalgia Bait series, Jade Cocoon is actually a game that I never have beaten before, despite playing it when it first released thanks to being able to rent it at a local Blockbuster. That's because, fortunately or unfortunately, due to your ability to merge your captured monsters, you can get some rather interesting critters. And I was unfortunately banned from renting it again as a teenager because I accidentally made, in monetization-friendly terms, a flying phallic friend. And while this had me laughing hysterically in the moment, this did actually leave me disappointed for a long time since, aside from the winged sausage, the actual core game seemed fun, and it has been on my backlog list to beat since I got older and was able to buy a copy for myself. I just needed an excuse, and a series on nostalgia was the perfect one. Now, was it actually a good game, or did my memory betray me? And even more importantly, how does the game hold up today? And really, if you enjoy monster collectors and want to dig into one for a solid weekend, the 8 to 12 hour jaunt through the main story was pretty fun even today, especially with the fact that while the actual collecting of monsters is fairly standard, they are designed around you mixing, matching, and merging to adapt your party to your playstyle rather than just collecting them all. This, combined with a story reminiscent of the nature-focused Studio Ghibli movies of the time, as well as interesting aesthetic choices such as your summons growing and visibly aging as they gain levels, made it feel much more immersive than simply assembling a library of Pikachus and Bulbasaurs. And in case you wanted to spend more time with it, the game also features a massive and challenging post-game, just in case you enjoyed the core cycle and wanted to see how far it could be taken. Though this post-game is pretty much just there to serve as your endless dungeon challenge run from other games of the era, and let you get to see some of the truly endgame level powers, since oddly, the core story only gets you about a quarter of the way there. And this, in an unfortunate twist, leads the game to feeling a bit half-finished to me, though admittedly this is likely an unfair feeling since the game is absolutely a finished title, even if it is short due to development limitations. And it admittedly has a bit of a hand-waved ending, but it was good enough to get a sequel. I think this half-finished feeling is also partially because the story portion of the game plays like it is a title that you'd expect to be much, much longer. More in line with the 30-plus hour experiences you'd get from games like Final Fantasy or Legend of Dragoon. But instead, it is more akin to if you snatched one of the more complex cities out of those games and just played that with a little more story tacked onto the side to explain the world's setting. That's not to say that the lore lacks depth though, you can pack a lot into 8 to 12 hours. The minimum spoiler version is that there's a lot to dig into there, from your simple beginnings as the inheritor of the role of Cocoon Master from your father, wed by tradition to your friend due to her lineage, as well as the mechanics and history of the world in general that have you learning about ancient gods, greed, conflict, etc., as well as watching your close friend and now wife bear a burden of scars and pain to aid on your adventure as generations before her had done. Now, as was the norm at the time, there's very few of these that have actual mechanical implications, but over time you will notice the world change in the assumption that you used the features available, with your wife Mabu actually getting 5 sprite and model changes over the course of the story to reflect the passing of time as you venture through the 4 forests. Sadly, it is worth noting that it does not matter if you actually use her services or not, since for the sake of plot, it assumes you did, so there is no sparing her from her rather sad fate. Now, if you wanted to dive a bit deeper into the story, as mentioned earlier, it follows a Ghibli theme, with a message of mankind's interactions with nature poisoning it. It's also how we can be a force of aid or harm to the world, and ultimately seeing a great amount of destruction as a result of various actions and power struggles of mankind both within and without of itself, that can only be mended with time and effort. Even the gods and other entities bear a striking resemblance to those you'd find in other nature-oriented Ghibli films like Princess Mononoke, so this absolutely wears its origins on its sleeve. Now, while this is nice, and the fact that there's a lot of voice acting serving as an icing on the cake, the real bread and butter of the title for a lot of the game's fans is actually the monster collecting and combining mechanic. On the surface, it will seem somewhat similar to Pokemon, with you wearing down an enemy and then capturing them with the game's MacGuffin, in this case cocoons, if it wasn't obvious. Each monster has its element, occasionally multiple, that functions in the standard rock, paper, scissors format you'd come to expect from both RPGs and monster collectors of the time, though admittedly a bit limited with just fire, water, earth, and wind. This, however, does work out to the game's advantage, since too many more than that and the combination mechanics would become a bit of a royal mess. This is because, while you can combine same into same to just get a stronger version of the creature at an accelerated rate, you can also combine any creature with any other creature to create a hybrid that adopts portions of both of its base creatures, both in appearance and functionality. This can be used to get access to certain skill combinations or to compensate for various shortcomings in your limited party of 3 monsters, and the playable character, of course. Though generally, the optimal strategy is to stick with creatures of the same element to maximize their potential on that path and just play the heavy rock, paper, scissors game with it. Now, while elements and base creature do determine spells, special damage, and weaknesses, there is, of course, also raw stats on the creature as well, such as speed, as well as physical and magical attack and defense, and to a lesser extent, health and mana. So combining monsters with fast physical attack growth with each other would result in a strong physical attacker, but usually a weak magic creature, and vice versa. This often means that you'll not only be deciding which units to combine based on element, but also stat growth, which thankfully is shown on convenient charts when doing the combinations at the Maiden. Thankfully, until the postgame, you can kinda get away with messing around here, with only a few of the area bosses being actually a problem if your monster was too weak or too diluted. Though, speaking of weak, you can also fight using your protagonist, but generally you're only going to want to do that when trying to capture a monster, since they're relatively weak compared to even your mediocre summons. And you can only have one fighter active at any given time, so it's usually best to do the bulk of your fighting with your summonable friends. Now, despite it not really having any mechanical purpose, I think one of the most interesting aspects of the game is actually an aesthetic choice we mentioned earlier. As your monster levels, regardless of if they're a vanilla monster or some weird-looking Derposaurus Rex with dragonfly wings, they actually visually age, getting bigger and having different parts of their anatomy grow at different rates, meaning that your little low-level monsters will actually look different from their high-level adult counterparts. I think the only other odd mechanic that might throw some people off is that despite the game mostly following the rules of normal RPG design with items and such, it actually deviates when it comes to money generation. Instead of enemies dropping money or even just junk items you can sell for money, the only consistent way to generate it is actually through the sacrifice of collected monsters for money, by weaving them into silk rather than merging them with your party. This means that it will always be a choice between power and money. This all makes the game hit that nice balance of familiarity and novelty, at least for its era, and overall I would say Jade Cocoon is definitely worth a journey through for anyone who loves monster collector titles, doubly so for people who enjoy Ghibli movies as well, especially Mononoke and Castle in the Sky. The only downside is if you're looking for a long burning RPG, this will fall a bit short since this really can be reasonably beaten in a weekend or two with little trouble.